Okay, the Michelle Obama has a dick thing is obviously not true. It is a funny meme. All right. It looks as though we're going to have to cancel class today because I got a message. The way we do these is there's one focused student that we are doing the class for, and that individual cannot make it, it seems. So we'll play around with some memes for a little while, and then I'll get back to other work, and we'll skip this class and maybe do it later. We usually do a double session on Mondays, so maybe we'll start a little bit later. Funny. This one makes me laugh so hard. Okay, actually, for those of you who are watching on Twitter, I just posted and pinned a link to join the live stream. The individual who'll be joining us later for the discussion is in a different time zone, but has already read the essay. So typically, what we do is we read the essay aloud during the class, and I'll talk a little bit about what we're covering today and why. So, we are going through the Backbone 101 course for the entire philosophy curriculum, and that is the year one course. And the year one course is done in a very different style than what we were doing with the year two stuff and the year three stuff. The year one stuff is we are going to look at eight major fields of philosophy, big questions that are still alive today. And we're just going to cherry pick instead of doing it chronologically and historically and with a narrative to it like we do in year two. We're going to just cherry pick important essays from major contributors to that question in the entire course of. Oh, let me just fix this. Sorry. So basically we're going to survey the battlefield and we're going to see who the big generals are and what the major camps are and some of the ways that they argue with each other. We finished determinism versus free will first. Then we did the mind body problem, which is what we're redoing right now so that it's recorded, and we're doing it with Elena, who will be here later. And then we did the existence of God, which was a really fantastic section, and it is the preface to the philosophy of religion course, which we are starting on Fridays. So on Fridays, we're going to start doing the full philosophy of religion course. This course that we're doing today is done on Mondays and Wednesdays. And when it's finished, well, actually, not when it's finished, on Thursdays, we're going to start the philosophy of mind course. So what we're focusing here on Mondays and Wednesdays is just one little section, the mind body problem, and we're looking at different contributors to it, but we're going to be starting on Thursday the philosophy of mind course. And that's going to be really fun. So instead of doing this backbone course on Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, we're now just going to be doing it on Tuesdays, and we'll be doing philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion year one material where we look at sort of an overview of the field and we read different essays in it. Um, there's a few other courses that'll be added at some point once we're done with these. We'll swap them out in the schedule. We've got an ethics course and a metaphysics course, and what's the other course? A metaphysics course, I think an epistemology course that we do in the same year one style. So the backbone course is just, little tastes of each of those. We're halfway through it now. We're going to be starting on Tuesday, the next section, and we have four more sections to go. But um, continuating those classes, complementing them with these local ones that we're starting on Thursday and Friday with philosophy of mind and philosophy of religion. Then the year two material is much, 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 much different. Instead of reading essays like that, what we're doing is we're basically starting with Thales and working up to Socrates, and doing an entire ancient philosophy course, a medieval philosophy course, modern, Kant, and we're doing it chronologically and historically with a narrative. So there's a lot of a metaphysical or metaphysical, metaphilosophical vantage point where we're doing philosophy, but we'll stand a little bit in the realms of mythopoetry and art and uh, yeah, mythopoetry and art, and theology, and we'll try to just sort of look at the conversation as a whole of what philosophy is in this Western record that we have of it. And so there's like 12 really powerful lenses for interpreting philosophy in that course, and I'm really excited to do that at some point. But we're just trying to get through the year one material right now. And on Saturdays, we're doing a little bit of year three stuff. We're doing so there's some other professors that will be providing alternative, paths for year 3, but the course that's available that we'll be doing at some point is Decoding Zarathustra, which we did on Twitter Spaces last year, along with some cherry-picked stuff from the year 2 material. So we go through Zarathustra line by line. as our backbone course, and then to complement that, we look at a few other thinkers, and one of them is Jordan Peterson, different thinkers that are sort of children of Nietzsche in one way or another. And, so on Saturdays right now, we have started I think it's at, 11 in the morning Eastern Time. We've started the Jordan Peterson thing, so, we're doing that on Saturdays, and, what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna find out how to turn this light on, and we are going to oops, there we go. What we're gonna do is we're gonna read this essay that Elena has already read, and then she'll join us later, and we'll have our discussion. Oh, clicked the wrong thing. We just close out of that, close out of that. We will what's the best way to do this? Click that, okay. Music's still playing, there we go. Okay. Alright, so we are doing the philosophy of mind for the second time with Elena now. So what we'll do since she's already read this and she'll be in later is we are going to look at the essay that we're reading. It's the third essay. We spent quite a lot of time on David Hume and on Reid, both of whom were very interesting for different reasons. This is a slightly longer essay, so I'm going to start getting into it right now. And I was going to say once we're done with this, but actually on Thursday, without us being done with this section, we are going to jump into the philosophy of mind course where we'll talk about reductionism and emergence and qualia problems and AI, and if it is or is not possible to even have AI, challenges or potential challenges to materialism. Uh, what else? So many things: behaviorism, functionalism, all sorts of different approaches that are developed in philosophy for trying to understand the mind. And that's going to be starting Thursday. So, this is sort of the intro to that, where we look at just the mind body problem and we cherry pick some essays. The Traditional Problem of Body and Mind by C.D. Broad. There's a question which has been argued about for some centuries, now under the name of interaction. This is the question whether minds really do act on the organisms which they animate, and whether organisms really do act on the minds which animate them. I must point out at once that I imply no particular theory of body or mind by the word to animate. I use it as a perfectly neutral name to express the fact that a certain mind is connected in some peculiarly intimate way with a certain body and under normal conditions with no other body. This is a fact even on a purely behavioristic theory of mind. On such a view, to say that the mind M animates the body B would mean that the body B, insofar as it behaves in certain ways, is the mind M. A body which did not act in these ways would be said not to be animated by a mind, and a different body, B prime, which acted in the same general way as B, would be said to be animated by a different mind, M prime. Okay. So we remember, for those of you who are just joining, that the mind body problem essentially boils down to examining the conceptions we have of what is mental and what is physical, and then asking ourselves this question: wait a minute, these things seem so foundationally and fundamentally different that it's not clear how they could possibly interact with each other. In fact, since Elena's not here, why don't we just use this opportunity to pull up our slides again? Here we go. They're right there, ready to go. Okay, so there's lots of different camps that, let's see, we'll do it this way. Oh, not that way. We'll do it. Oh, come on. Which one of these is correct? There we go. Right. We'll do it this way. So there's lots of different camps, and we actually talk about more than just these, but there's a bunch of different camps. And there are monists who say, no, everything is just mental, everything is mind, and the bodies are dreams of the mind or creations of the mind or something like that. There are materialistic monists, monists who say, no, everything is physical and body, and anything your mind is just processes that your brain goes through or states of your brain or something like that. But most philosophers fit into one of various different camps of what are called dualistic interactionism. It doesn't matter that it's most, but there's most of the camps that exist in some sort of that area. But it's a very difficult question, right? Everybody's saying, look, the monists are saying we don't have to deal with the question if we say there's only one thing. The panpsychists, in a very different way, actually accomplish the same end, it seems. But there's other views as well. So let's take a quick look at them. And again, the problem is if, okay, if I stub my toe, something mental called pain happens. It's not just that I get a message that my toe has bumped into something, there's an experience with a quality to it of pain. And so it seems like you can use a needle and physically move bodies around and make mental things happen. And likewise, it seems to me that when I decide to raise my arm, I will in my mind as a mental thing to move my arm up, and then the physical body is moved. And so it seems the common sense view might be something like a dualistic interactionism. But the problem for philosophers is saying, well, okay, fine, maybe it works in practice, but does it work in theory? How can we what's wrong with our ideas of mind or our ideas of body or both of those sets of ideas that make it seem like, wait a minute, the mind is not located in a place and it doesn't have length, breadth, and width or mass or anything like that. So how can it, even if it's just one neuron it has to push on to get the dominoes falling, how is it capable that things so fundamentally different from one another could have an effect on each other? So that's it. So if the mind and body are two different things, how can one affect the other and vice versa? Are we one thing, two things, three things? What are we? For our purposes, we'll only consider two, mind and body. And so we talked about the fact that in philosophy, the word mind sometimes means brain. In the mouths of some philosophers, it means soul. In the mouths of other philosophers, it might even mean something like soul and or spirit, or soul as distinct from a third thing, spirit. There's so it's not like there's agreement exactly on what this is, but all of for the discussion to move forward, we can at least start with the idea that by mind we at least mean mental things, which seem qualitatively completely different from physical things. All right, so the dualistic interactionists say that we are two things, mind and body, and the two interact with one another. The will is mental, it makes the body move. The senses are part of the body, they create the impressions upon the mind to form the sensations. There are substance theorists and bundle theorists, and we don't have to talk about the distinction. And then there's monists, there are materialists or idealists. And we mentioned, one might say it's all mental, it's all idealistic, it's all ideas and maybe the something like that. And then there's other monists who say, no, it's all material, it's all bodies and the brain and what it's doing. That's what we think of as mental. And the epiphenomenologists are sort of a group that is kind of similar to the monistic materialists, but not exactly. And so we'll take a look at them in a moment. We tried drawing a few pictures. So here's the materialistic monist. You've got a body and a brain and nothing else. Your mind is what your brain is doing, perhaps, or it's another word for your brain, or it's about brain states or something like that. But that's all there is. You got one thing, material. Then you've got the dualistic interactionists. They say, look, the mind is totally separate from the body. The brain's a part of one or both of them. We're not sure exactly how they can interact with each other. Maybe it's through the brain that they're interacting, maybe not. Either one of these pictures would be, we could consider those arrows with question marks on them if we don't have an answer for how it's possible yet. But they affirm that, look, the body affects the mind affects the body. We're not exactly sure how either of those happen, but let's try to figure it out. The epiphenomenalists say, look, the body affects the brain and the brain affects the body. The brain's part of the body, something like that. Maybe we could have even put the brain in the body in this diagram here. It's all body. The bottom part is all body, right? And that's fine. And they can affect the mind, the mental things. They make mental things happen, but the mental things never affect the brain or the body. There's no arrow going back down. So they say essentially what's happening with you and with history and with everything is that there's a bunch of physical processes. Think of it as a river, and the river is flowing and curving. There's little whirlpools in it or sticks floating down it or whatever. The river's doing something. It's cutting into a bank. But then there's something else that the river does, which is that it bubbles and it makes a babbling noise. It sprays mist and things like that. And so basically the idea is that the mental oh, hey, Elena, we're just rehearsing all of this. I'm glad you made it. So the mental is essentially just sort of riding on top of, and it never goes back to affect the course of the river. The river, it's all really material that's doing everything. But isn't it nice that there's a little a little cream in the coffee, right? There's this pleasant thing of the mental that goes along for the ride and colors our experiences. Okay, fine. Then there are the parallelists. There's a group of them, and one group is called occasionalists. And believe it or not, there's a very impressive philosopher who made the following argument, which is that the mind cannot possibly affect the body, and the body cannot possibly affect the mind. He thought about what we meant by mind and what we meant by body. He examined them rationally. He's one of the children of Descartes in the Rationalist Project. His name's Melin And he said, look, I know for sure it's not possible. And yet I know that it seems like it's possible. It seems like the mind makes the body move. And it seems like if you prick the body, a mental sensation happens. And so there's an all powerful God who wants the world to look reasonable. And so every time I will my arm to move, he creates a miracle which allows my arm to then move. And every time I stub my toe, another fill in the gap miracle happens, which allows me to have the mental experience of the pain. But these two things don't actually affect each other directly. He also thought that it was true of bodies alone. He examined the idea of bodies when one billiard ball bumps into another billiard ball and they deflect each other and bounce off in a what would the physicists say, an inelastic collision, conserving their momentum. All of that is miracle after miracle. It's the God wants the world to look reasonable and to obey certain laws. And so when the one ball hits the other, bodies are just length, breadth, and width. They're nothing but extension, and there's nothing in that idea that has the capacity to impart motion into another thing that's length, breadth, and width. So he thought miracles were happening there too. A different type of parallelist, a very different type, is a harmonist who says, look, actually, we're living in two worlds and they overlay each other perfectly. So whenever event X happens, it happens mentally and it happens physically. And whenever a physical thing happens or a mental thing happens, it's just the it's all parallel, right? We're living in two worlds at the same time. And so your mental things map perfectly over the physical things, and it's just two different worlds, always in harmony. Slightly different from that view is the perspectivists who say, yeah, 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 it's like two worlds, but really it's one thing. It's this one line here. But if you look at it from one angle, it looks concave. And if you look at the exact same part from the other angle, it looks convex. And so things look materialistic from one vantage point, and so it looks like bodies, and it looks mental from another vantage point, from the personal experience and what it's like to be me and the qualia and all that. And so we just say, well, it's really one world. You're not living in two worlds that just happen to be in perfect harmony. You're living in one world. You're just able to see it from two vantage points. Spinoza had this idea that human beings have two languages available to them for describing experience, the subjective and the objective languages, and that either one could be used to explain all of the phenomena of the world entirely, and that neither of them translated in any way to the other one. And so this is a perspectivist parallelist approach. The panpsychists, and there's a couple of things here, but basically what they're saying is that all of the, mind, body isn't just length, breadth, and width. Physical things have color, they have impenetrability, they have location, they have temporal qualities. There's all sorts of qualities that bodies have, and one of the qualities that bodies have is mental. The proton itself has a very, 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 very subatomic and primitive form, perhaps, of consciousness to it. It's not like it's sitting there thinking, I love being a proton, or if only I could be a proton slightly somewhere else. It's not thinking propositional thoughts like that any more than a clam probably is. However, all matter is made up of the fundamental building blocks that our more sophisticated mental structures make use of. All right. So that's a panpsychist. Everything pan has psyche in it, is the perspective. And then there are these qualiaists. I'm not sure. All right. So let's see. So similar to, yeah, we could call that a type. So this isn't its own camp, but the panpsychists or the epiphenomenologists, very, very different group, or uh, or some of the parallelists, and maybe even more groups than that, can think of this qualia question. So we won't focus on it right now. We're going to have a whole section devoted to it in our next class, to which this is an introduction that we will be starting on Thursday. for the qualia question. So let's move on. The idealist monist, body is nothing but a conception of the mind. Everything is mental. And there were well, we could skip a few and go to the materialist. Oh, I guess. Well, the idealist materialist would say everything is body and the brain is doing things or being in a certain way, and that's what makes them mental. We had a student the first time we went through this, Savad, and so Savadian channeling was this idea that perhaps your body and maybe your brain is a part of your body that's like an antenna that can channel the consciousness, and that there's these two different things. But the body has the ability, like a radio receiver, to pick up on something. Again, the question of the dualistic interactionism does still seem to be present here, right? It's maybe a good way of making the question stark, but it's not clear how things that are fundamentally physical could be channeling, picking up on, making readings of things that are purely mental. But here's an interesting way of thinking about it. Then there are agnostic interactionists. Now, that's different than saying we don't know, right? Most theorists are in one form or another a dualistic interactionist. They affirm positively that it's dualistic interactionism, and then they try to argue for how it's possible. And then there are people who deny that it's possible. But the agnostic interactionists say, look, it's definitely happening, but we can't possibly figure out how. It's maybe beyond our knowledge to know how they can interact. So all of the dualistic interactionist theories that you come up with for explaining it, none of those are going to work, and I'll argue gleefully against them because it's very clear that they interact. It works in practice. We not only don't know if it works in theory, but it will never work in theory. But they still affirm it works in practice. And then there's a very interesting group of people, we can call them pseudo problemists, who say actually, um, we'll be reading an essay by a pseudo problemist in short order, so we won't make any more time for that right now. Okay, so with all that being said, this is now our third essay, and welcome. We're going to read through it about as quickly as we can because it's a little bit longer than the other two that we've covered. Um, and then we're going to go into the after show, and Elena and I have some things to discuss. And then since this is Monday, we might be doing a second show later today. We got a late start, so we'll see. Okay, there's a question. I use it as a perfectly neutral area. The problem of interaction is generally discussed at the level of enlightened common sense, where it is assumed that we know pretty well what we mean by mind and matter and by causation. Obviously, no solution which is reached at that level can claim to be ultimate. If what we call matter should turn out to be a collection of spirits of low intelligence, as Leibniz thought, the argument that mind and body are so unlike that their interaction is impossible would become irrelevant. Again, if causation be nothing but regular sequence and concomitance, as some philosophers have held, it is ridiculous to regard psychoneural parallelism and interactionism as mutually exclusive alternatives. For interaction will mean no more than parallelism, and parallelism will mean no less than interaction. Nevertheless, I'm going to discuss the arguments here at the common sense level. Okay, so he brought up a few what he's identifying maybe as fringe perspectives that could deal with the problem. He's saying, let's forget about those. Let's imagine that the problem exists within our common sense of we understand what we mean by causation. We've basically have a notion of the mental and a notion of the physical. How are we going to make sense of these two interacting with one another at the common sense level? Because they are so incredibly bad and yet have imposed upon so many learned men. We start then by assuming a developed mind and a developed organism as two distinct things, and by admitting that the two are now intimately connected in some way or other, which I express by having that this mind animates this organism. We assume that bodies are very much as enlightened common sense believes them to be, and that even if we cannot define causation, we have some means of recognizing when it is present and when it is absent. The question then is, does a mind ever act on the body which it animates? And does a body ever act on the mind which animates it? The question which common sense would give to both questions is yes, certainly. On the face of it, my body acts on my mind whenever a pin is stuck into the former and a painful sensation thereupon arises in the latter. And on the face of it, my mind acts on my body whenever a desire to move my arms arises in the former and is followed by this movement in the latter. Let us call this common sense view two sided interactionism. That's how he'll call it. That's fine. Although it seems so obvious, it has been denied. Although it seems so obvious, it has been denied by probably a majority of philosophers and a majority of physiologists. So the question is, why should so many distinguished men who have studied the subject have denied the apparently obvious fact of two sided interaction? The arguments against two sided interaction fall into two sets: philosophical and scientific. We will take the philosophical arguments first, for we shall find that the professedly scientific arguments come back in the end to the principles or prejudices which are made explicit in the philosophical arguments. Okay, very briefly, he's now going to try to take apart the philosophical arguments against dualistic interactionism, which he's calling two sided interaction, which is probably what we'll call it the rest of this time here. And then he's going to look at the scientific arguments against two sided interaction and try to take them apart. He spends a great deal more time on that. And then he's going to do difficulties in the denial of interaction. So he's going to say, okay, fine, you've brought up these problems of interactionism and I've tried to answer them, but have you noticed that you have new problems, right? If you're going to deny interaction, there's some new problems that come up. So then he's going to start an offensive attack against anything that's not dualistic interactionism. And then he makes some positive arguments in favor of interactionism. So let's see if we can get through this now. Was on mute. 1 second. Who's a good boy? I wonder how long I've been on mute. Yeah, right. No one can deny that there is a close correlation between certain bodily events and certain mental events, and conversely, therefore, anyone who denies that there is action of body on mind and mind on body must presumably hold a that concomitant variation is not an adequate criterion of causal connection, and B, that the other feature which is essential for causal connection is absent in the case of body and mind. Now, the common philosophical argument is that minds and mental states are so extremely unlike bodies and bodily states that it is inconceivable that the two should be causally connected. It is certainly true that if minds and mental events are just what they seem to be to introspection and nothing more, and if bodies and bodily events are just what enlightened common sense thinks them to be and nothing more, the two are extremely unlike. And this fact is supposed to show that, however closely correlated certain pairs of events in mind and body respectively may be, they cannot be causally connected. One of the things that we've done as a side note in these classes is every once in a while we've looked at the style of arguing and picked up on some interesting techniques or styles, uses of argument, things like that from different authors. One of the things that jumps out at me about this author is that he's framing things. Okay. He's setting up the argument in such a way that's probably going to be sort of the framework, the formula, the backbone of his attempts to take it out. So he says, look, if you're going to deny this common sense view that minds affect bodies and bodies affect minds, you have to hold two things. One, that things going together all the time is not enough to know that there's a causal connection, not enough to establish it at least, or and then two, that whatever else you would need for a causal connection besides always going together all the time is lacking in body and mind. All right. So that's the ghost he's going to argue against. And he's sort of set up the boxing match in that way. And then he says, Well, let's see. Evidently, the assumption at the back of this argument is that concomitant variation, together with a high enough degree of likeness, is an adequate test for causation, but that no amount of concomitant variation can establish causation in the absence of a high enough degree of likeness. All right. So now he's saying, look, you see that these things are always going together, but then you also notice that when we look in our minds at the concepts we have of bodies and of minds, that those things are very, very different. And so your position must be that even if things always seem to go together, always, 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 if the concepts you have of those things are are of such unlikeness that you can't conceptualize how one could cause the other, then you still have room. So he's saying, if you're arguing with me, you must think that that gives you enough room to deny um, two-sided interaction, as he calls it. Now, I am inclined to admit part of this assumption. I think it is practically certain that causation does not simply mean concomitant variation. And if it did, pare question. Hence, the existence of the latter is not ipso facto a proof of the presence of the former. So he agrees with the first part. Again, I think it is almost certain that concomitant variation between A and B is not, in fact, a sufficient sign of the presence of a direct causal relation between the two. I think it may perhaps be a sufficient sign of either a direct causal relation between A and B or of several causal relations which indirectly unite A and B through the medium of other terms, C, D, etc. All right. So first he agrees. He says, look, just because two things always happen, I always turn off my alarm in the morning and the sun always rises 15 minutes later. Me turning off my alarm doesn't cause the sun to rise, right? The fact that the sun just rose doesn't cause my alarm to go off. So he says, I agree. I agree. Just because two things always happen together doesn't mean the one is causing the other. But then he says, I will leave open the idea that maybe if they always go together, you could say they don't cause each other directly, but there's probably a big nexus of causal events of which those two are linked, right? I need to wake up in the morning. The sun is what we mean by the morning, right? There is a causal connection between my turning off my alarm and the sun coming up. It's just not direct between the alarm turning off and the sun or the sun rising and the alarm. But he's leaving it open for now. He's not saying for sure, but he's leaving it open that maybe if two things are always going together, that's at least enough to suggest perhaps he's leaving it possible that we could argue that they have to be in some sort of a link together causally. But so far I agree with the he's not saying that for sure right now. He's just leaving it open. So far, I agree with the assumptions of the argument, but I cannot see the least reason to think that the other characteristic, which must be added to concomitant variation before we can be sure that A and B are causally connected, is a high degree of likeness between the two. One would like to know just how unlike two events may be before it becomes impossible to admit the existence of a causal relation between them. Now, remember, this is how he's phrased the other side. He said, look, you must think that even though things are always happening together, that you don't presume they're causally linked if they're unlike each other enough. Now, the mind body problem says they're fundamentally completely unalike. So it's not just say that there's a high degree of unlikeness, but let's see what he does with this to maybe prime our intuitions. No one no one hesitates to hold that drafts and colds in the head are causally connected, although the two are extremely unlike each other. For the unlikeness of drafts and colds in the head does not prevent one from admitting a causal connection between the two. Why should the unlikeness of volitions and voluntary movements prevent one from holding that they are causally connected? To sum up, I am willing to admit that an adequate criterion of causal connection needs some other relation between the pair of events besides concomitant variation. But I do not believe for a moment that this other relation is that of qualitative likeness. Okay. So we can see that he's already suggesting a way of pushing back against this. It's not clear how strong that argument's going to be, but he hasn't given it yet, but he's paved the way. But before he does that, he's going to get into the scientific arguments against two-sided interaction. And if we've learned anything from well, in our second year material and third year material, we talk about this explicitly, but if we've learned anything from examining these great contributions to these big questions in the other sections, is that there's something objectifying about all of this of the assumptions one has to make in order to do science in the first place, right? So we might just end up seeing, especially with the determinism, free will, and William James coming in and making his argument. We start to understand that there's a necessary adoption of a perspective that banishes consideration of certain things that we can still know to be true about the beginning stages of the scientific approach, and that way lies many errors in our assumptions nowadays. But who knows? Let's see what he's going to say. So scientific arguments against two-sided interaction. I imagine this is going to be, hey, we've examined psychologically or neuroscientifically what the brain is doing. We never found a little mysterious ingredient called mind that was playing a role. It's all like that, right? But so let's see. There are, so far as I know, two of these. One is supposed to be based on the physical principle of the conservation of energy, and on certain experiments which have been made on human bodies. The other is based on the close analogy which is said to exist between the structures of the physiological mechanism of reflex action and that of voluntary action. I will take them in turn. One, there is an argument from the conservation of energy. Scientific ears should be pricking up right now, right? The law of the conservation of energy, pretty big law in science. And these poor philosophers are sitting here thinking, oh, I can come up with a theory of how the mind affects the body and vice versa, all in the face of scientists who are going to say, wait a minute, hold on. Stop. What are you talking about? If this violates the law of conservation of energy, I think you've got a problem. So let's see how that goes. The argument from energy. It will first be needful to state clearly what is asserted by the principle of the conservation of energy. It is found that if we take certain material systems, example, a gun, a cartridge, and a bullet, there is a certain magnitude which keeps approximately constant through all their changes. This we call energy. When the gun has not been fired, it and the bullet have no motion, but the explosive in the cartridge has great chemical energy. When it has been fired, the bullet is moving very fast and has great energy of movement. The gun, though not moving fast in its recoil, has also great energy of movement because it is very massive. The gases produced by the explosion have some energy of movement and some heat energy, much less chemical energy than the unexploded charge had. These various kinds of energy can be measured in common units according to certain conventions. To an innocent mind, there seems to be a good deal of cooking at this stage, i.e., the conventions seem to be chosen and various kinds and amounts of concealed energy seem to be postulated in order to make the principle come out right at the end. I do not propose to go into this in detail for two reasons. In the first place, I think that the conventions adopted by the postulates made, though somewhat suggestive of the fraudulent company promoter, can be justified by their coherence with certain experimental facts, and that they are not simply made ad hoc. All right. I want to pause before he gets to the next one because somebody might be wondering why these three sentences here. I want to just make a quick comment, which is this is the right way for a philosopher to listen to a scientist. Okay. What is this joke he's making? First of all, he doesn't think he's disproved science. He doesn't think he's thrown the science textbooks in the bin by what he's saying. He absolutely doesn't think that at all, and has explicitly made clear that he doesn't think that, and given good reasons for trust in the scientific process and how they came to these conclusions. However, it's not for the philosopher to say, um, okay, Mr. Physicist, explain to me what's happening when this object rolls over this place and this type of thing. He says, well, okay, so the first thing we're going to do is ignore air resistance. And you have to remember there's a little bit of heat and a little bit of like elastic molecular things going on between the objects. And there's a little bit of sound that's created. So we're not really taking into account all of the energy and where it's going because, but it's so close. And then you can imagine that this other stuff takes account of it, and the philosopher should say, okay, yeah, that sounds really reasonable. You smashed two balls into each other, they bounced off. You saw this law of conservation of momentum and energy, and you measured the masses before and after, and you measured the velocities before and after, and you did all this stuff, and it didn't come out all that perfectly. according to your simple formula, but your simple formula was generated in the context of simplifying everything. And you've got some story for me about, well, okay, it worked out to 3 decimal points, but at that level, there's thousandths of a joule of energy being lost here and being lost there, and we didn't take that into account. But we could probably build a big box and do the whole experiment in there and just measure the temperature of the entire system throughout. And the scientists are quite clever at answering these types of questions and at posing them to each other. Um, but so the only thing I want to say is that he was dealing with a light touch, this philosophical explanation. And it's funny that he's doing it because it's such a well established scientific principle. He says, "Look, I get it. To those of us in philosophy, this sounds like, yeah, how sure are you? How sure are you really? 3 decimal points. That's how sure you are. Are you sure there's not something else going on here?" The scientists maybe or the philosophers maybe are less easily convinced, and they ought to be. And that doesn't mean that they say, I believe things that are the opposite of what the scientists' experiments show. And it also doesn't mean that they think, oh, the scientists are probably all full of nonsense. As he says here, their theories are not just given ad hoc, right? They're not just coming up with a just so story. There's a little bit that sounds like that. But look, I think they're probably pretty much right about this, would be my guess, right? He's not making statements of faith about what they find, and he's understanding that comes within the context of simplifying things in order to make sense of them. So I thought it has nothing to do with the purpose of this essay and what we're talking about today, but it's something I wish to talk more about and at greater length in another place and time. So, and to make some different points that are just too tangential to this to bring up right now. So we'll just take note of the fact that it's a little bit funny sounding to our scientism worshiping ears, but this is what philosophers do, and it's what they ought to do. Um, what philosophers often do is put up a signpost in the philosophy department saying, I just argued successfully and correctly that the STEM fields are where you really should be because that's the right way of doing things. And they think they have nothing to say after that. And I think that is a tragic mistake. And I think it's time is about up. I think philosophers are about to get tired of doing that and realizing, like, wait a minute, there's a lot more to this than just that. But who knows? We'll see. Let's move on to a second point. Secondly, I shall show that the conservation of energy is absolutely irrelevant to the question at issue, so that it would be waste of time to treat it too seriously in the present connection. Now, it is found that the total energy of all kinds of this system, when measured according to these conventions, is approximately the same in amount through very different, dis- differently distributed, although very differently distributed after the explosion and before it. If we had confined our attention to a part of this system, and its energy, this would not have been true. The bullet example had no energy before the explosion and a great deal afterwards. A system like the bullet, the gun, and the charge is called a conservative system. The bullet alone, or the gun and the charge, would be called non conservative systems. A conservative system might therefore be defined as one whose total energy is redistributed but not altered in amount by changes that happen within it. Of course, a given system might be conservative for some kinds of change and not for others. So far, we have merely defined a conservative system and admitted that there are such systems, which, for some kinds of change, at any rate, answer approximately to our definition. We can now state the principle of the conservation of energy in terms of the conceptions just defined. The principle asserts that every material system is either itself conservative or, if not, is part of a larger material system which is conservative. We may take it that there is good inductive evidence for this proposition, right? So he's not at all doing what I was saying. It sounded like he almost was about to do, which is, hey, wait a minute, maybe all this science is wrong and let me overturn it, which, by the way, he has a right to do as a philosopher if he wants to. He's not likely to be successful at that attack on this topic, and he's not interested in doing that either. Um, so let's not mistake him into thinking that he's saying, well, the scientists are approximating things, but really, no, no, no. He's saying, look, let's take it. Let's take it as there's really good inductive reason through scientific ways of thinking to conclude that as a whole, the universe conserves energy. Fine. He's going to say, that's fine. The next thing to consider is the experiments on the human body. These tend to prove that a living body With the air that it breathes and the food that it eats forms a conservative system to a high degree of approximation. We can measure, so with the food, right? It's not saying the body, it says the body with the food and the air, the whole thing is a system, but it conserves energy. We can measure the chemical energy of the food given to the man and that which enters his body in the form of oxygen breathed in. We can also, with suitable apparatus, collect, measure, and analyze the air breathed out and thus find its chemical energy. Similarly, we can find the energy given out in bodily motion, movement, in heat, and in an excretion. It is alleged that, on the average, whatever the man may do, the energy of his bodily movements is exactly accounted for by the energy given to him in the form of food and of oxygen. If you take the energy put in food and oxygen and subtract the energy given out in waste products, the balance is almost exactly equal to the energy put out in bodily movements. Such slight differences as are found are as often on one side as on the other, and are therefore probably due to unavoidable experimental errors. I do not propose to criticize the interpretation of these experiments in detail because, as I shall as I shall show soon, they are completely irrelevant to the problem of whether mind and body interact. But there's just one point that I will make before passing on. It is perfectly clear that such experiments can tell us only what happens on the average over a long time. To know whether the balance was accurately kept at every moment, we should have to kill the patient at every moment and analyze his body so as to find out the energy present then in the form of stored up products. Obviously, we cannot keep on killing the patient in order to analyze him and then reviving him in order to go on with the experiment. Thus, it would seem that the results of the experiment are perfectly compatible with the presence of quite large excesses or defects in the total bodily energy at certain moments, provided that these average out over long periods. However, I do not want to press this criticism. I am quite ready to accept for our present purpose the traditional interpretation which has been put on the experiments. So that's look, he wants to play with this, so we're gonna let him, and it's right for him to do so. He's saying there's many ways that you might criticize science, not to say that it's wrong, but to say that it's not as ultimate in its knowledge as it thinks it is. And philosophers are in a perfect position to do that. The other groups of people who do that are sometimes scientists who say, look, our current theory isn't as good as it needs to be, but here I've got a new one and let's test this out and move it forward. But the philosopher here is saying, the best your science can do for giving me confidence that your conclusion is correct is to say that on average, things generally seem to work out this way. But have you done any experiments that would let you know if every millisecond or every, like, let's say every billionth of a second, energy is added and taken away by every single system, just sort of coming into being and going out of being so rapidly that you don't detect it? I mean, how do you know that's not the case? I mean, you've got this law that it has to work out this way because over the course of a week or maybe 8 hours or 3 hours, you measured some things, you carefully measured them here and there, and they were basically the same with slight fluctuations that balanced out on each side. So, you can say, "Yeah, I think this is basically how the world works." And that's true. We don't want to disagree with it, but it's not so well founded as you might imagine it to be. All right. Well, that's an interesting aside. It has nothing to do with this point, so we won't spend any more time on it. It's a clever thing to come up with that would maybe spur us in science to say, "Hey, let's do a more careful experiment. Take that into account and see if we can't really prove this. Let's get to the subatomic level. Let's really, really try." And then maybe when we do that, we'll make a particle accelerator. And then when we do that, maybe we'll find that there are really weird things going on that we weren't expecting, and that'll be new knowledge too, right? But the philosopher doesn't have to build the particle accelerator. He can sit here and just say, I don't know why you should be this confident, but I'm totally fine to go along with it. It sounds perfectly fine to me. So he doesn't go on to it more because he doesn't think that this law of conservation of energy, even if it was a total absolute 100%, even if it was a completely accurate 100%, let me take away this. There. Oh, I accidentally took away Elena. Oh no, she's still there. Okay. Even if this law was the most true law in all of physics or truer than anything else we ever knew, um, it wouldn't matter because he doesn't think that the law of the conservation of energy means that minds can't affect bodies and bodies can't affect minds. But apparently, there is an argument which says that. So we're going to have to look at it. So let's see. We now understand the physical principle and the experimental facts. The two together are generally supposed to prove that mind and body cannot interact. What precisely is the argument? And is it valid? I imagine that the argument, when fully stated, would run somewhat as follows: I will to move my arm and it moves. If the volition has anything to do with causing the movement, we might expect energy to flow from my mind to my body. Thus, the energy of my body ought to receive a measurable increase, not accounted for by the food that I eat and the oxygen that I breathe. But no such physically unaccountable increase of bodily energy are found. Increases of bodily energy are found. Again, I tread on a tin tack, and a painful sensation arises in my mind. If treading on the tack has anything to do with causing the sensation, we might expect energy to flow from my body to my mind. Such energy would cease to be measurable. Thus, there ought to be a noticeable decrease in my bodily energy, not balanced by increases anywhere in the physical system. But such unbalanced decreases of bodily energy are not found. So it is concluded that the volition has nothing to do with the causing of my arm to move, and that treading on a tack has nothing to do with causing a more painful sensation. We can see where he's going to go with this already, can't we? Because of his hint. Well, I can think of at least three things he might say here, right? So let's just guess and speculate ahead before we read, because that we might be surprised by what he says. And sometimes it's good to make a prediction and then see how wrong you were. That'll make the salient differences will start popping out. And so let's do a little thought experiment here. All right, now wait a minute, hold on. He set up the experiments to say, wait a minute, you're not measuring every tiny little thing. Well, another thing you might say is, okay, I step on a tack, it sends a message to my brain. We don't measure any loss of energy in my body when that happens. Well, how did we do that? Did we measure all the energy in my body right before I stepped on the tack and then right after I stepped on the tack so that no other physical or mental things going back and forth across that border, which we're positing can't exist, could have happened to counterbalance it? What if the mental sensation of pain is a response to, let's say, some energy. I don't think this is how it works, by the way, but the argument proposes that the body has to lose some energy to the mental in order to send it something, and that when the mental through will is sending something to us, it's right. Well, what if the sensation isn't of the painful experience isn't to be understood as only a mental thing, but rather that energy coming back, and so they perfectly balance each other in the sense that whatever energy was sent this way, a sensation happened, which is, meant a mental thing, but that mental thing itself is the process of putting that energy back or something like that doesn't account for anything. Also, you might say, well, okay, wait a minute. A guy is standing there and you prick him with a pin, and 15 minutes later you measure all the energy in the glass box you put him in, and 15 minutes before you pricked him with the pin, you measured all the energy in the glass box that he was in, and you say, look, we didn't lose any energy when we pricked him with the pin. It's like, okay, he was also standing there, so he was getting sensations through his feet. You didn't even need to prick him with the pin. He should have just been continually losing energy. But then he was also thinking and modeling the world. And it's a mental thing, a lot like volition. So the world is speaking at him, but he's modeling and imagining and making pictures of and perceiving the world. And so it's are those two sides of the same thing, so that all the energy flows this way and all the energy flows that way. So you're not nothing's being lost in that system, perhaps. That's one way somebody might think about it. But some people would be very dissatisfied with an idea like that because they want to say the mental is something like the spiritual. It's not physical at all. And so so what that first view posits is that sure, it could be spiritual in a sense, or it could be non-physical in every possible way, but there's a pool of energy there, and it's interacting with and just the same amount is going in both directions, and you're not going to get just the one event and say it should have been a net loss of energy for the body out of that. So who knows? But that's probably not where he's going to go with this. But let's see what he has to say, because he's going to look probably just at the argument right? Because earlier he said, well, this is the science and here's how it's done. And there's a lot of room there for wondering if something like what I just said is maybe possible. But he then says, let's just look at it philosophically. So probably he's not going to try to come up with a scientific sort of a theory to explain it and say, hey, now go test this and see if you can maybe make your instrument sharp enough to see if it's a dual interaction that's constantly happening. That's probably not going to be his response, but he did leave it open in our imaginations to start thinking that perhaps it was something like that, which would explain away this confidence that is unearned in the scientific community, he thinks, when they speak on the idea that we know from the law of conservation of energy that minds and bodies cannot interact. Let's see what he does with this argument, though. Because, well, let's look at it again. If we know he's probably going to go philosophically, and we look at the argument, he's saying, I presume that there must be a energy sent from the body to the mental, to the mind, or from the mind to the body. And that might be just an assumption. That premise, he might negate it. Let's see what he does. Is this argument valid? In the first place, it is important to notice that the conclusion does not follow from the conservation of energy and the experimental facts alone. The real premise is a tacitly assumed proposition about causation, viz., that if a change in A has anything to do with causing a change in B, energy must leave A and flow into B. This is neither asserted nor entailed by the conservation of energy. Conservation of energy can be completely true. Why are you positing this also? He says. What it says is that if energy leaves A, it must appear in something else, say B, so that A and B together form a conservative system. Since the conservation of energy is not itself the premise for the argument against interaction, and since it does not entail that premise, the evidence for the conservation of energy is not evidence against interaction. Is there any independent evidence for the premise? We may admit that it is true of many, though not of all, transactions within the physical realm. Okay, so what is he highlighting here? Not the conservation of energy. He's saying the conservation of energy is not a law that tells you whenever anything interacts with anything else, it must give up some energy to that thing. That was added. You added that. You said conservation of energy, and then you added this other premise. Whenever A and B interact, there's an energy transfer. So where did that come from? That doesn't come from conservation of energy. It must come from your other experiments and your other examinations of the world. And then he's going to say, well, is that true of all physical interactions in the world? Every time anything interacts with anything else in the physical world, is there an energy transfer? He says, we may admit that it is true of many, though not of all, transactions within the physical realm. But there are cases where it is not true, even of purely physical interactions. And even if it were always true in the physical realm, it would not follow that it was always true in the transactions, true of trans physical causation. Okay. So he's positing three ideas here. This is kind of cool. One, if it's true that every time a physical object A interacts with physical object B, there's an energy transfer, even if that was completely true, that doesn't mean that there has to be an energy transfer between physical things and non physical things, like mental things. You're just assuming that that would go along, but why would that have to go along? And then he says, I don't even think it's true of all physical A and physical B. I think sometimes physical object A interacts with physical object B and there's no energy transfer. Take the case of a weight swinging at the end of a string hung from a fixed point. The total energy of the weight is the same at all positions in its course. It is thus a conservative system. But at every moment, the direction and velocity of the weight's motion are different, and the proportion between its kinetic and its potential energy is constantly changing. These changes are caused by the pull of the string, which acts in a different direction at each different moment. The string makes no difference to the total energy of the weight, but it makes all the difference in the world to the particular way in which the weight moves and the particular way in which the energy is distributed between the potential and the kinetic forms. This is evident when we remember that the weight would begin to move in an utterly different course if at any moment the string were cut. String and a weight, two physical things. interacting with one another. Who would deny that? Interacting with one another in a way where one of them is changing in a way that you can measure. You can measure the energy changes if you want to use that model. It doesn't even have to be that in this argument, right? It doesn't even have to be that the string and the weight are interacting in a way that changes the energy state of the weight, but it happens to be the case that it's changing its direction and its velocity, how much potential it has. Like if you go and put your hand in front of the weight right when it's at the top of the swing, it barely presses on your hand, doesn't touch it at all in the moment that that happens. But if you put your hand in the way when it's swinging quickly at the bottom of the pendulum, it's going to break your hand. All right? So clearly something's changing about the weight, and the weight swings back and forth, conserving energy. It's a conservative energy system. You don't need to expand out to the rest of the universe. There's nothing else happening here. The string is interacting with the weight and it's changing the weight, but there's no energy transfer between the string and the weight. No net energy transfer, he says. These changes are caused by the pull of the string. String is cut. Here, then, we have a clear case, even in the physical realm, where a system is conservative but is continually acted on by something which affects its motion and the distribution of its total energy. Why should not the mind act on the body in this way? If you say that you can see how a string can affect the movement of a weight, but cannot see how a volition could affect the movement of a material particle, you have deserted the scientific argument and have gone back to one of the philosophical arguments. Your real difficulty is either that volitions are so very unlike movements, or that the volition is in your mind whilst the movement belongs to the physical realm. And we have seen how little weight can be attached to these objections. So he doesn't want to totally prove his interactionism here. He's just saying if your whole argument is just this scientific argument, you should rest assured. Don't worry. Law of conservation of energy can be completely preserved and it poses no problems to the idea of the mental affecting the physical and the physical affecting the mental if the way they affect each other is something like the way a string affects a weight and a pendulum. There's no energy transfer between the two, and yet they're clearly interacting with each other. If you still think that it can't happen, he says you must be going back to one of the other philosophical arguments, which is fine. We'll deal with them in due time. But if your only objection to believing that they interact is this conservation of energy thing, don't worry. It doesn't even suggest that the two couldn't interact with each other. Even physical things can interact under those circumstances. The fact is that even in purely physical systems, the conservation of energy does not explain what changes will happen or when they will happen. It merely imposes a very general limiting condition on the changes that are possible. The fact that the system composed of bullet, charge, and gun in our earlier example is conservative does not tell us that the gun will ever be fired, or when it will be fired, if at all, or what will cause it to go off, or what forms of energy will appear if and when it does go off. The change in this case is determined by pulling the trigger. Likewise, the mere fact that the human body and its neighborhood form a conservative system does not explain any particular bodily movement. It does not explain why I ever move at all, or why I sometimes write, sometimes walk, and sometimes swim. To explain the happening of these particular movements at certain times, it seems to be essential to take into account the volitions which happen from time to time in my mind, just as it is essential to take the string into account to explain the particular behavior of the weight, and to take the trigger into account to explain the going off of the gun at a certain moment. The difference between the gun system and the body system is that a little energy does flow into the former when the trigger is pulled, whilst it is alleged that none does so when a volition starts a bodily movement. But there is not even this amount of difference between the body system and the swinging weight. Thus, the argument from energy has no tendency to disprove two sided interaction. It has gained a spurious authority from the august name of the conservation of energy, always written in capital C, capital E. But this impressive principle proves to have nothing to do with the case. And the real premise of the argument is not self evident and is not universally true, even in purely intra physical transactions. In the end, this scientific argument has to lean on the old philosophic arguments, and we have seen that these are but bruised weeds. Nevertheless, the facts brought forward by the argument from energy do throw some light on the nature of the interaction between mind and body, assuming this to happen. They do suggest that all the energy of our bodily actions comes out of and goes back into the physical world, and that minds neither add energy to nor abstract it from the latter. What they do, if they do anything, is to determine that at a given moment, so much energy shall change from the chemical form to the form of bodily movement. And they determine this, so far as we can see, without altering the total amount of energy in the physical world. He still left a few things open, a few caveats, but he said, look, this is an impressive theory, this conservation of energy. I embrace it wholly. I imagine it's universally true. Even if that's the case, it has nothing to say about whether or not the mind and the body can interact with one another. So don't worry if you think to yourself that that's a reason not to believe in mind body interaction. It's not. And the other premise of the argument is certainly not a universal truth. And so then he thinks it might suggest to us the ways in which the mind and the body affect each other. It would be more like a string pulling on a pendulum weight than it would be a domino bumping into a domino, say. However, it occurs to me that that doesn't have to be the case scientifically, right? Because he's thrown that out there. But what we had said earlier about the idea that maybe every interaction between mind and body is like it's like a two-sided trade in a imagine a marketplace where you buy things with money, but the only way the merchant will take the money is if you also immediately take it back and sell him something else, right? It's a completely ridiculous system, obviously, but you could imagine it existing. And so typically we use money as a medium of exchange because we want goods from people who don't necessarily want the goods that we have. So we want a universally valued thing that they will take in order to buy something else that they want that we don't have. I want shoes, but I build houses and I want shoes from a guy that doesn't need a house. So I build a house for somebody else. They pay me money and I use some of that money to go buy some shoes because everybody's valuing the money. But what if we had a market system, say, where we ridiculously had the utility of a medium of exchange of a currency, and yet we never made use of the benefits of it because as soon as you had money, you immediately wanted to get rid of it. Maybe we have runaway inflation. So I go to buy my shoes and I give the guy money and he's happy to take a certain amount of money for the shoes. But then as soon as I take the shoes and he's holding the money, he realizes how quickly it's devaluing. And he says, quick, quick, sell me your shirt. I have to have something else for this money. Right. Well, okay, it's ridiculous. It won't last for very long. But it could be that the mind and the body are interacting in that way. So that there could still be an energy transfer between the two, so long as it's always one of a net, it goes back and forth. Anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is, all of that speculative nonsense is unimportant to the argument, right? It's nice to imagine these conceptual possibilities, and maybe uh, it'll prod some scientists to say, "Oh, I want to disprove that one. Let me go set up an experiment," and that's all pleasant and very useful. But none of that matters for the argument, right? You don't have to believe any of these stories that we're coming up with. These are like the just so stories earlier that he was pointing out about trying to even how difficult it was to even measure for sure if you've got all the energy still conserved in any set of experiments. This doesn't matter, right? None of this matters. What matters is that the argument that you can't have mind body interaction from the conservation of energy doesn't follow from the conservation of energy. It follows from this other principle of every interaction must have an energy transfer. And that we know not to be true even of physical systems. So it's not a universal truth. And so it might suggest to us, like he says, that maybe there's a way the mind and body are interacting without an energy transfer, because obviously such things are possible. In any case, conservation of energy doesn't disprove dualistic interactionism, he says. Two, the argument from the structure of the nervous system. This is the next set of scientism arguments. And this, I'm going to call them scientism arguments because I think they're making that mistake that we've already identified a few times, which is to say, in order to do my science, I have to banish all consideration of anything mental and subjective and conscious like, and anything that has to do with the subject. I wish and long to be I, not even a subject. but to be objective in my, not my, because I want not to be a subject, to have statements that are from the perspective of a completely objectified world, but not from that perspective, because I don't want it to be from a perspective. I want it to be really just objective, right? Okay, fine. If that's what you're trying to do, and then you look around at everything that you've discovered and you say, "Oh my gosh, I've never discovered anything conscious or subjective in any of this." So yeah, in order to make all your progress, you had to banish consideration of those things. It doesn't mean that they're not real. And it doesn't mean that you have any reason to think they're not real. But let's see if that's what this if this follows that general way of thinking. The argument from the structure of the nervous system. There are purely reflex actions, like sneezing and blinking, in which there is no reason to suppose that the mind plays any essential part. Maybe. Now, we know the nervous, it depends on what you call the mind, right? If a clump of cells right here that detect a message and immediately make me flinch, that could be part of my mind if you want to think of it that way, but it's not conscious mental in any event. Now, we know the nervous structure, which is used in such acts as these. A stimulus is given in the outer end of an efferent nerve, right? I'm sorry. A stimulus is given to the outer end of an efferent nerve. Some change or other runs up this nerve, crosses a synapse between this and an afferent nerve, travels down the ladder to a muscle, causes the muscle to contract, and so produce a bodily movement. There seems no reason to believe that the mind plays any essential part in this process. The process may be irreducibly vital and not merely phy- physico physicochemical. But there seems no need to assume anything more than this. Now, it is said that the whole nervous system is simply an immense complication of interconnected nervous arcs. The result is that a change which travels inwards has an immense number of alternate paths, which the afferent disturbance happens to take. We're having a technical issue. One moment. We have many technical issues, so if you'll bear with us here. Okay, one moment. Yes, sir. Okay, let's finish this up in just a second here. Actually, let's stop there. Let's stop on the second argument from the structure of the nervous system. We can see where it's going to go, right? It's going to be, hey, look, I prick my finger, message comes up about this far. It immediately sends a message back here to pull my hand away because it's really, really hot. And then the message goes up to my brain, and maybe I have some mental things, but the mental things aren't involved in that quick jerk reaction. Okay, it's an efferent nerve, a sensing nerve, and it's a send a message, an afferent nerve sending a message down to do something to the muscle. That whole thing, nobody thinks there's something mental. Not nobody. Panpsychists think so. People who theorize that the mind is distributed throughout the body and that they're, the parallelist. There's all sorts of people who think all sorts of things, and we'll be looking at all of those. But he says, in general, the common sense view is that there's no mind going on here. You don't have a conscious mental activity when this happens. And then it's posited, he says, that, well, the brain is nothing but a whole bunch of those types of things, right? That's one bit of, let's say it's one unit of um, nervous system bodily interaction. And the brain is just quadrillions of such circuits all interwoven and feeding off each other. And so then, of course, what you're going to do as a scientist is say, oh my gosh, look, I have found nothing mental at all. And there is nothing mental, they think. And it makes them feel a certain way when they think it. But in any case, um, we're gonna pick up next time with that argument and then see how the philosopher that we're reading, Broad, how he uh, approaches that argument, how he deals with it, what he thinks it actually entails, and what it means. And so we will end the stream here.